There is a number that historians still argue about: 16 centuries. No, 13 centuries after it happened. It is so vast, so difficult to hold in the mind that many people simply refuse to believe it when they first hear it. Some say the true figure can never be known. But even the smallest, most cautious estimate describes a loss so enormous that it may be one of the greatest catastrophes in the entire history of the human race. And here is the strangest part of all. Almost no one in the Western world has ever heard of it. It did not happen in Europe. It left behind no famous ruins that tourists visit today. It produced no single monument that the whole world would recognize. And so it slipped, quietly, into the shadows of history. A disaster on a scale that dwarfs events far more famous, remembered by scholars and poets, but forgotten by nearly everyone else. This is the story of how the richest, most advanced, most sophisticated civilization on Earth tore itself apart from the inside. It is the story of how a golden age ended, not with a foreign invasion, but with a single man's ambition, a court's blindness, and a betrayal that set the world on fire. But to understand the scale of what was lost, you first have to understand the extraordinary height from which it fell. Because in the middle of the 8th century, there was no place on Earth more brilliant, more powerful, or more confident than Tang Dynasty China. Imagine a city of over 1 million people at a time when the largest cities in Europe held only a few tens of thousands. Its name was Chang'an, and it was the beating heart of the Tang Empire. It was, by almost any measure, the greatest city in the world. Its walls stretched for miles in a vast, perfect rectangle, enclosing wide avenues laid out in a precise grid, some of them broad enough to march dozens of horsemen abreast. At its heart rose the imperial palace, a complex of halls and gardens and courtyards so large it was a city within the city. Down those great avenues flowed the wealth and wonder of half the world. Chang'an sat at the eastern end of the Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes stretching thousands of miles across deserts and mountains all the way to Persia and beyond. Through its gates came merchants from Central Asia, Persia, India, and Arabia. Camels laden with goods filled the marketplaces. In the streets, you could hear a dozen languages spoken in a single afternoon. There were foreign traders, foreign musicians, foreign priests of foreign faiths. Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Nestorian Christians, Muslims, all living and worshipping side by side in a city that welcomed the world. It was an age of astonishing beauty. This was the great era of Chinese poetry, a time when verse was not a hobby for a few, but the very language of an educated life. Two of the greatest poets who ever lived in any language, Li Bai and Du Fu, walked the roads of this empire and wrote of its moonlight, its wine, its friendships, and, later, its unbearable grief. Painters, sculptors, and musicians flourished under imperial patronage. Fine porcelain and shimmering silk flowed out of workshops whose techniques were secrets the rest of the world would not master for 1,000 years. And over all of this presided an emperor whose long reign had come to seem like a golden summer that would never end. His name was Xuanzong, and he had ruled for decades. Wisely, at first, brilliantly even, presiding over a period of peace and prosperity that his people would remember ever after as a lost paradise. Under him, the population of the empire swelled. Records from the time suggest that around the year 754, the census counted a population of some 52 million people. It was a civilization at the very peak of its powers, seemingly secure, seemingly eternal, seemingly untouchable. But paradise, as it so often does, had grown careless. And deep within the glittering court, in the very heart of that golden age, the seeds of its destruction were already taking root. Think, for a moment, of what it meant to be born into this world. A child growing up in Chang'an in those years would have known a life of almost unimaginable richness compared to nearly anyone else alive on the planet. There was order in the streets, kept by an efficient administration. There was food, carried in along a vast network of canals and roads from the fertile provinces. There was learning and art, and the quiet confidence of a people who believed, with good reason, that they lived at the center of civilization itself. To be Tang, in that moment, was to belong to the most advanced society the world had ever produced. No one imagined it could end. No one ever does. Picture the city at its height on an ordinary evening. As the sun set behind the western mountains, the great drum towers would sound, and the gates of the many walled wards within the city would close for the night. Lantern light would flicker to life along the canals. In the entertainment districts, music drifted from upper windows. In quiet courtyards, scholars bent over their books by candlelight, preparing for the rigorous examinations that could lift a common man into the ranks of the powerful. In the temples, incense curled toward heaven. It was a civilization that had perfected the art of living, and it had done so on a scale and with a refinement that no other place on earth could match. The people who lived within it did not think of themselves as fortunate. They thought of their world as simply the way things were, and always would be. The trouble began, as it so often does, not with an enemy at the gates, but with a change in the heart of an aging ruler. As Emperor Xuanzong grew older, the sharp focus of his early reign began to soften. The man who had once risen before dawn to pore over the business of the empire grew weary of the endless labor of governing. He began to withdraw from the daily work of rule, to lose himself in music, in art, in the pleasures of his magnificent court. And above all, he lost himself in love. Her name was Yang Gifei, and she is remembered as one of the great beauties of Chinese history. The emperor became utterly devoted to her, enchanted by her charm, her grace, her talent for music and dance. Their romance would later be immortalized in some of the most famous poetry in the Chinese language. But love, in the life of an emperor, is never a private thing. When a ruler raises one person above all others, he raises their family with them. And the family of Yang Gifei rose very high indeed. Chief among them was her cousin, a man named Yang Guozhong, who used his connection to the beloved consort to climb to the very summit of power, eventually becoming chief minister of the entire empire. He was ambitious, grasping, and widely resented. A man who had reached the heights not through decades of proven service, but through the accident of his cousin's beauty. And in the great and dangerous game of court politics, Yang Guozhong made himself a rival and an enemy of the one man in the empire powerful enough to destroy everything, a frontier general named An Lushan. An Lushan was, in almost every way, an outsider. He was not of pure Han Chinese descent. His father was a Sogdian, one of the great merchant peoples of Central Asia, and his mother was of Turkic origin. He had risen through the ranks of the Tang military on the empire's rough northern frontier, far from the refined poetry and silk of the capital. He was a soldier's soldier, enormously fat, famously crude, cunning, and charismatic. And through a combination of genuine military skill and shrewd flattery, he had made himself a favorite of the aging emperor. Xuanzong trusted him. Indeed, the emperor showered An Lushan with extraordinary honors and, most dangerously of all, with power. An Lushan was made military governor of not one but 3 of the empire's northern frontier commands. This gave him control over a vast, battle-hardened army. By some accounts, nearly 200,000 troops, among the finest and most experienced soldiers in the entire empire. It was a concentration of military might in the hands of a single man that should never have been allowed. But the emperor, secure in his golden twilight, did not see the danger. He saw a loyal servant. Others saw something very different. Yang Guozhong, the chief minister, watched An Lushan's growing power with mounting alarm and jealousy. The 2 men despised each other. Yang repeatedly warned the emperor that An Lushan was planning to rebel. Partly, perhaps, out of genuine suspicion, but partly to destroy a rival he feared. An Lushan, for his part, watched his enemy whispering against him at court and understood, with growing certainty, that his days were numbered. He knew that the moment the old emperor died, Yang Guozhong would move to have him destroyed. He faced a simple, brutal calculation: strike first or wait to be struck down. And so, in the bitter cold of December in the year 755, An Lushan made his choice. From his northern base, he gathered his enormous army and announced that he was marching on the capital. Not, he claimed, to seize the throne for himself, but to rescue the emperor from the corrupt and traitorous Yang Guozhong. It was the oldest excuse in the history of rebellion. But the soldiers behind him were real, and their numbers were staggering. and they began to move south like a flood breaking through a dam. The Golden Age was over. It had simply not yet realized it. To understand how one man could come to hold such terrifying power, we must understand the quiet rot that had spread through the empire's defenses. In the early Tang, the armies had been raised from ordinary farmer soldiers who served their term and returned home. But over the decades, this system had decayed and been replaced by permanent professional armies stationed on the distant frontiers, loyal not to the distant court, but to the charismatic generals who led them and paid them and shared their hardships. And Lushan's soldiers did not think of themselves as servants of a faraway emperor. They thought of themselves as the men of An Lushan, and that single shift, invisible to most at court, was the crack through which catastrophe would pour. There were warnings, if anyone had cared to read them. Wise officials had noted for years the danger of allowing so much military power to gather in the hands of frontier commanders. But the court was distracted, complacent, lulled by the long summer of peace. It is one of the oldest patterns in all of history. The disaster that everyone could have seen and no one wished to. And Lushan understood the court better than the court understood him. He played the part of the loyal, simple frontier soldier to perfection, flattering the emperor, charming the powerful, making himself seem too crude and too devoted to ever pose a threat. Behind that mask, he watched and waited and prepared. For years, he quietly strengthened his position, stockpiled weapons and horses, and bound his soldiers ever more tightly to himself. When the moment came, it would not be the impulsive act of an angry man. It would be the calculated strike of one who had been getting ready for a very long time. The empire was utterly unprepared. For decades of peace and prosperity, the interior of China had known no war. The great professional armies were stationed far away, out on the distant frontiers, guarding against threats from the steppe and the deserts. The heartland itself, the rich and populous provinces around the two capitals, was soft, undefended, and completely unready for the storm that was descending upon it. And Lushan's veteran frontier troops marched south against forces that were, in many places, hastily assembled levies of untrained men. The results were catastrophic, and Lushan's army moved with terrifying speed. Within weeks, the great eastern capital of Luoyang had fallen. There, in the captured city, An Lushan cast aside the pretense that he was merely rescuing the emperor. He declared himself the ruler of a new dynasty, which he called the Great Yan, proclaiming that the mandate of heaven had passed from the Tang to him. The rebellion was now a full civil war for the throne of the world's greatest empire. There was still one great obstacle between the rebels and total victory: a narrow, heavily fortified mountain pass called Tong Pass, which guarded the road to the western capital of Chang'an itself. Here, the Tang had concentrated what loyal forces they could, and behind those walls, the veteran generals defending the pass understood something crucial. They knew that An Lushan's rebellion, for all its early success, was overextended. They knew that if they simply held their position and waited, the rebel momentum would falter. It was the correct strategy. It might have saved the empire and millions of lives and the Golden Age itself. But it was not to be. Back in Chang'an, the chief minister Yang Guozhong, frightened and suspicious, feared that the powerful generals holding the pass might become a threat to him. And so he pressed the emperor to order them out from behind their fortifications, to abandon their strong defensive position and march out to attack the rebels in open battle. It was a disastrous, fatal order. The loyal army was forced out of the pass it should never have left. In the open field, it was crushed. Tong Pass fell, and with it fell the last shield protecting the great capital of Chang'an. Now there was nothing between the rebels and the imperial city. And so came one of the most heartbreaking scenes in all of Chinese history: the flight of the emperor. Xuanzong, the ruler of 50 million people, the lord of the Golden Age, was forced to flee his own capital in the night, abandoning the greatest city in the world to the approaching enemy. With a small escort of soldiers and courtiers, and with his beloved Yang Gifei at his side, the old emperor rode westward into the mountains, a fugitive in his own empire. And it was on that desperate flight that the tragedy reached its terrible, intimate climax. At a posting station called Mawei, the exhausted, frightened, and furious soldiers of the emperor's own escort mutinied. They blamed the entire catastrophe on the Yang family. They fell upon the chief minister, Yang Guozhong, and killed him. But their fury was not yet spent. They surrounded the emperor and demanded the life of the one person he loved most in all the world. They demanded the death of Yang Guifei. The old emperor was helpless. His own guards would not march on, would not protect him until their demand was met. And so, to save himself and what remained of his court, Xuanzong was forced to consent to the death of the woman he loved. Yang Guifei was led away and, by most accounts, strangled with a silk cord, sacrificed to the rage of the mutinous soldiers. The most powerful man in the world could not save the one person who mattered most to him. It is a moment of such piercing human sorrow that poets have returned to it for more than 1,000 years. The image of the Golden Age dying alongside a doomed and beautiful woman on a dusty mountain road. We should pause here to feel the full weight of that flight from the capital. For an emperor to abandon Chang'an was not merely a military retreat, it was the shattering of a sacred idea. The emperor was the son of heaven, the still center around which the whole ordered world was meant to turn. His city was the earthly image of cosmic order itself. And now that center was fleeing in the dark, the sacred order collapsing into dust and panic on a mountain road. The people left behind in Chang'an watched their god emperor disappear and understood that the world they had trusted was truly ending. Behind him, the great capital, the wonder of the age, was left open to the rebel army. The city that had welcomed the whole world, that had glittered with 1,000,000 lives, now waited in terror for the conquerors to arrive. What took generations to build can be undone in an afternoon. That is a lesson history teaches again and again, and one that each new golden age insists, somehow, does not apply to itself. News of the disaster at Tong Pass reached the capital like a thunderclap. In a single stroke, the careful defense of the empire had been thrown away, not by the enemy, but by the fatal meddling of a frightened court. The people of Chang'an, who had believed themselves protected by the veteran armies at the pass, now understood that nothing stood between them and the rebels. Panic swept the great city. The wealthy loaded what they could carry and fled. The markets emptied. And in the imperial palace, the old emperor faced the unthinkable truth that his golden reign was ending in ruin. With Chang'an fallen and the emperor in flight, it might have seemed that the rebellion had won. But wars of this scale are rarely so simple, and the agony of China was only beginning. What followed was not a swift resolution, but 8 long years of grinding, catastrophic conflict that would ripple out across the entire empire and consume millions of ordinary lives. The broken old emperor Xuanzong abdicated, and his son took the throne, determined to reclaim what had been lost. The new emperor, Suzong, gathered what loyal forces remained and made a fateful decision. He would seek help from beyond the empire's borders. He borrowed cavalry from the Uyghurs, a powerful nomadic people of the northern steppe, and welcomed aid from other allies. With these reinforcements, the Tang began, slowly and at appalling cost, to fight back. The 2 great capitals were eventually recaptured. But the price of that foreign help was terrible. The Uyghur allies were, by agreement, permitted to plunder the very cities they helped to retake, and the people of those cities suffered horribly at the hands of friend and foe alike. Meanwhile, the rebellion began to devour itself. And Lushan, the man who had set the world aflame, did not live to see its end. He had grown increasingly ill, paranoid, and violent, tormented by disease that was slowly blinding him and driving him to fits of savage rage against those around him. In the year 757, less than 2 years into the war he had started, and Lushan was murdered, not by his enemies, but by his own son and King Ju in a palace conspiracy. And that son, in turn, was later killed by another rebel general, Shi Siming, who seized the leadership for himself. And Shi Siming, too, would eventually be murdered by his own son. The rebellion became a snake eating its own tail, a cycle of betrayal and patricide that dragged the war on, year after bloody year, long after its original cause had died. But the true horror of the An Lushan rebellion is not found in the names of generals or the maneuvers of armies. It is found in what happened to the ordinary people of China. The farmers, The mothers, the children, the villagers who had done nothing but happen to live in the path of the catastrophe. For 8 years, enormous armies marched back and forth across the most densely populated land on Earth. They seized food, burned fields, and emptied granaries. And behind the armies came the true killers of any long war: famine and disease. When soldiers strip a region of its food, the farmers who grew it starve. When populations flee in terror, they carry sickness with them into new lands. When the vast, intricate systems that fed a civilization of 50 million people, the canals, the granaries, the tax records, the trade routes, are shattered by years of war, the result is not merely a battlefield tragedy. It is the collapse of the very machinery that keeps millions of people alive. Whole regions were depopulated. Fertile provinces that had teemed with life became silent wastelands. The great poet Du Fu, who lived through these years as a refugee, wandering the ravaged countryside and at times near starvation himself, gave voice to the suffering in verse that still breaks the heart across the centuries. He wrote of fields and forests that stank of the dead, of rivers running red, of 10,000 villages sending their sons off to die. He asked, simply, where in all the land a person might find a place of peace. There was no answer. Consider what such a war meant for a single ordinary family. A farmer in one of the central provinces, who had never in his life seen a battle, might wake one morning to find an army passing through his lands, his stored grain seized, his oxen taken, his fields trampled or burned. If he was fortunate, he survived with nothing. If he was not, he was conscripted or killed, or simply left to starve through the winter with his children. And when one army had passed, another might come the next season or the next year, taking whatever the first had left. Families were scattered across the roads of a collapsing empire, parents searching for children, children left orphaned in the ruins of villages that no longer had names. Multiply that single family by the many millions, and the abstract horror of the census numbers begins, at last, to take on a human face. The suffering spread far beyond the battlefields in ways that are difficult, even now, to fully grasp. An empire is not merely its armies and its cities. It is a vast, delicate web of human cooperation. The farmer who grows the grain, the boatman who carries it along the canal, the official who records the harvest, the merchant who moves goods from province to province. When war tears that web apart, the damage does not stop when the fighting stops. Fields go unplanted because the men who worked them are dead or fled. Canals silt up and flood because no one maintains them. Trade halts because the roads are no longer safe. And so hunger spreads outward in widening circles, reaching villages that never saw a single soldier, killing people who never knew the name of the general whose ambition had doomed them. This is the cruel arithmetic of civil war in a crowded land. The sword kills its thousands, but the collapse that follows kills its millions. And the ones who die in that second wave are almost always the most innocent and the most helpless. The very old, the very young, the poor, the women left alone to feed families in a world where food had simply ceased to exist. Among the countless voices lost in those years, one survives with piercing clarity, that of the poet Du Fu. He was no distant observer. He lived the catastrophe, separated from his family, traveling the broken roads, watching the suffering of ordinary people with the eyes of a man who could not look away. In one poem he described returning home to find his youngest child had died of hunger in his absence. In another, he wrote of the endless columns of conscripts, weeping as they were marched away to war, their parents and wives clinging to them along the roadside until the dust swallowed them. Through his verse, the abstract catastrophe becomes unbearably real. We do not merely know that millions died. Through Du Fu, we stand beside a single grieving father, and we feel it at last, in the year 763, after nearly 8 years of war, the rebellion was finally crushed. The last of the rebel leaders was dead, and the Tang dynasty had, technically, survived. But survival is not the same as recovery. The empire that emerged from the war was a broken shadow of the brilliant civilization that had entered it. And now we return to that number. The one that historians still argue about, the one so vast it is hard to believe. When we try to measure what was lost, we turn to the imperial census. Before the rebellion, around the year 754, the census had recorded a population of roughly 52 million people. After the rebellion, in the year 764, a new census was taken. It counted fewer than 17 million. On paper, in the space of a single decade, some 36 million people had vanished. Now, historians rightly caution us about this number. Much of that staggering drop was not death, but disappearance from the records. The collapse of the government's ability to count its own people. When the machinery of the state breaks down, when tax officials flee and records burn and whole regions fall outside imperial control, millions of people simply stop being counted, even if they are still alive. And so the true death toll is fiercely debated. The most cautious estimates suggest perhaps 13 million deaths. Others hold that the higher figures reflect a real and almost unimaginable catastrophe. But even the lowest, most careful estimate describes one of the deadliest events in all of human history. A loss of life that, by some measures, represented a significant fraction of the entire human population of the planet at that time. Let that truth settle for a moment. In an age long before machine guns, before bombs, before any of the industrial tools of mass death, human beings managed to bring about a catastrophe on a scale that rivals the world wars of the 20th century. And they did it to themselves, from within, in what had been the most peaceful and prosperous society on Earth. The Tang dynasty would limp on for another century and a half, but it never truly recovered. The confident, cosmopolitan, world-embracing empire was gone forever. In its place came a more fearful, more inward-looking, more suspicious China, one that increasingly distrusted the foreigners it had once welcomed so warmly. The golden age of poetry and porcelain and open roads had closed, and it would not come again. And here is the thought that lingers, long after the numbers and the names begin to fade. The people of Chang'an, walking those wide avenues in the year 754, breathing the incense of 100 temples, listening to music from a dozen lands, could not have imagined that their world was about to end. They lived at the very summit of human achievement, in the greatest city on Earth, in an empire that seemed as permanent as the mountains. They had no reason to believe that within a single lifetime, tens of millions of them would be gone, their fields silent, their records burned, their golden age remembered only in the aching verses of a wandering poet. We remember the fall of Rome. We remember the great plagues. We build our histories around the catastrophes of the West. But here, on the other side of the world, a disaster unfolded that may have been larger than any of them. And it has drifted almost entirely out of the world's memory. Perhaps that is the final tragedy of the An Lushan rebellion. Not only that so many died, but that so few of us ever learned their names or paused to consider that they lived at all. The least we can do, 13 centuries later, is remember that they were there, that they were real, that once, in a city of 1 million souls, the whole world came to trade and sing, and that it did not last, because nothing built by human hands ever truly does. There is something almost unbearable in the quiet of it. A war that killed on the scale of the 20th century's worst catastrophes, fought with swords and spears and arrows, village by village, family by family, across 8 long years, and yet, in the wider memory of humanity, near silence. No great museum draws crowds to mourn it. No solemn anniversary is marked each year. The tens of millions who lived and suffered and died have become, for most of the world, not even a memory, but a blank space where a memory should be. It is worth asking why we forget some catastrophes and remember others. Part of the answer is simply where the story is told and in what language. The fall of Rome was recorded and retold for centuries by the civilizations that inherited its memory, until it became a permanent fixture of how the Western world understands its own past. The An Lushan rebellion was recorded too, meticulously, by Chinese historians and grieved over by Chinese poets. But that memory stayed largely within China, and the wider world, busy building its histories around other centers, simply never absorbed it. A tragedy is not measured only by how many died, but by how many afterward chose to remember. And by that measure, the millions lost in these 8 years were doubly unfortunate. And so the golden age passed into memory, and the memory itself passed into shadow. The wide avenues of Chang'an, once filled with the music of the world, grew quiet. The empire that had believed itself eternal learned, as every such empire eventually learns, that nothing made by human hands stands forever. What remains is the poetry, and the numbers, and the long silence where a great civilization once sang.